The dagger enters his chest before he realizes the servant standing beside him is not who he claims to be. The vizier of the Seljuk Empire gasps, clutching at the blade, staring into eyes that show no fear of the 100 guards rushing toward them. The assassin doesn't run. He doesn't need to. His mission is complete, and his death is irrelevant. Within hours, every ruler from Cairo to Baghdad will hear of this killing. They will double their guards. They will trust no one. They will sleep poorly, if at all. This is the genius of Hassan-i-Saba's creation, not the killing itself, but the terror that follows. For nearly 2 centuries, the assassins ruled through reputation alone, turning fear into their greatest weapon. Kings trembled. Empires negotiated. No fortress seemed safe from the blade that could appear anywhere, wielded by anyone. It then came an empire that did not negotiate, an empire that did not fear, an empire that responded to psychological warfare with something far simpler: total annihilation. If you want more dark history like this, subscribe to the channel for stories that reveal what lurks beneath. The fortress of Alamut rises from the Elburz Mountains like a stone fang piercing the Persian sky. Perched on a narrow ridge of volcanic rock, it stands nearly 2,000 meters above sea level, surrounded by steep valleys and treacherous paths that have broken armies before they could reach its gates. The year is 1090, and Hassan-i-Saba, a man who has studied Islamic theology, mathematics, and the intricate politics of the Seljuk Empire, stands at those gates for the first time as its master. He has not conquered it through siege or battle, and he has taken it through conversion, persuasion, and patience, turning the castle's inhabitants to his cause one by one until the lord who commanded it simply left. This is how Hassan operates. This is how he will teach his followers to reshape the world. Hassan-i-Saba is not interested in armies. Armies are expensive, visible, and vulnerable. They require feeding, training, housing. They announce their presence across landscapes and give enemies time to prepare defenses. Hazen has studied the mechanics of power and identified its weakness. Power concentrates in individuals. Remove the individual, and the structure trembles. Kill the right person at the right moment, and you can topple kingdoms without fielding a single battalion. But to kill the right person, you need more than a blade. You need access. You need trust. You need invisibility. You need men who will walk into certain death as calmly as they would walk into a garden. The Nizari Ismailis, the sect Hassan leads, are already outcasts. They are Shia Muslims in a world dominated by Sunni Seljuk power, practitioners of esoteric interpretation in an age of orthodoxy, believers in a living imam when the dominant powers consider such claims heresy. They have been persecuted, marginalized, scattered. Hassan offers them something powerful: purpose and protection. He transforms Alamut from a mountain fortress into the headquarters of a new kind of resistance. He builds libraries, attracting scholars. He fortifies the defenses, making the castle virtually impregnable. He establishes a network of smaller fortresses throughout the region, creating a web of strongholds that can support each other. And most importantly, he begins training the Fedayeen, those who sacrifice themselves. The training is methodical and complete. Young men are selected for intelligence, discipline, and devotion. They are educated in languages, customs, and the subtle arts of infiltration. They learn to be merchants, servants, guards, scribes, any role that grants proximity to power. They study their targets for months or even years, embedding themselves so deeply into courts and households that they become invisible through familiarity. The assassination itself is almost secondary to the infiltration. By the time the blade appears, the real work has already been done. The Fedayeen understand something that most warriors do not. The value of a single death chosen with precision outweighs 1,000 deaths scattered across a battlefield. The first major assassination comes in 1092. Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire, is traveling with his entourage when a man dressed as a Sufi mystic approaches and stabs him. The assassin makes no attempt to escape. He is killed immediately. But Nizam al-Mulk, the architect of Seljuk administrative power, the man who has held the empire together through decades of internal strife, dies from his wound. The Seljuk Sultan himself, Malik Shah, dies weeks later under circumstances that remain suspicious. In the span of a month, the Seljuk Empire loses its two most crucial leaders. The empire fractures into competing factions. Wars of succession begin. And in the mountains of Persia, Hassani Saba watches the chaos he has unleashed with a single, well-placed blade. The message is clear to every ruler in the Islamic world. The assassins can reach you. Your guards cannot stop them. Your walls cannot protect you. The man serving your wine, grooming your horse, copying your correspondence, any of them could be the instrument of your death. This is psychological warfare refined to its purest form. The assassins do not need to kill everyone. They only need to kill enough to make everyone afraid. The killings continue with disturbing regularity. In 1113, Maudud, the governor of Mosul, is assassinated in a mosque in Damascus. In 1121, Ahmed ibn Nizam al-Mulk, son of the famous vizier and himself a powerful figure, is killed. In 1126, the Abbasid caliph's vizier falls to an assassin blade. Each death is public, theatrical, designed for maximum psychological impact. The assassins often strike in crowded places, mosques, markets, courts, where the target feels safest because they are surrounded by people. This amplifies the terror. If you can be killed in a mosque full of witnesses, where are you safe? The assassins develop a reputation that transcends their actual numbers. Estimates suggest Hassani Saba never commanded more than a few thousand followers at any given time, with perhaps a few hundred trained fedayeen. But their effectiveness creates an illusion of omnipresence. Rulers begin to see assassins everywhere. Paranoia spreads through courts like disease. Trust becomes a luxury no one can afford. Some rulers choose to negotiate, sending tribute to Alamut in exchange for being left alone. Others triple their guards and still sleep poorly. The assassins have weaponized uncertainty itself. Hassani Saba dies in 1124, but his creation outlives him. The successive leaders of Alamut, the so-called Old Man of the Mountain, maintain the system he built. They refine the training, they expand the network of fortresses, they continue the policy of strategic assassination, targeting those who threaten Nizari interests while carefully avoiding conflicts they cannot win. The order spreads beyond Persia into Syria, where they establish another network of mountain fortresses and carry out operations against Crusader and Muslim rulers alike. The Syrian branch becomes particularly notorious, entering into complex political relationships with various Crusader states, sometimes allied, sometimes opposed, always unpredictable. Western Crusaders encounter the assassins and bring stories back to Europe that blend fact with fantasy. They speak of the Old Man of the Mountain, who commands absolute loyalty from followers willing to die on his command. They claim he uses hashish to control his men, giving rise to the term assassin, though this etymology is disputed, and the stories of drug-induced obedience are almost certainly exaggerated. The reality is more disturbing than the myth. The Fedayeen do not need drugs to face death willingly. They believe in their cause with the kind of certainty that makes martyrdom not a sacrifice, but a privilege. By the mid-13th century, the assassins control a network of fortresses stretching across Persia and Syria. Alamut remains the crown jewel, its libraries filled with texts that span mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and theology. The order has become not just a military organization, but a center of learning and Ismaili culture. They have survived Seljuk campaigns, Crusader incursions, and the shifting politics of the fractured Islamic world. They have proven that a relatively small group, operating with precision and ruthlessness, can exert influence far beyond its numbers. They have turned fear into power and invisibility into invincibility. But power built on perception has a weakness. It requires that your enemies care about their own lives more than they care about destroying you. It requires that threats of death carry weight. It requires that rulers value self-preservation enough to make concessions. For 2 centuries, these assumptions have held true. Every empire the assassins have faced has operated under the same basic rules of political calculation. Weigh costs, minimize losses, negotiate when beneficial, fight when necessary, but not to mutual annihilation. In the year 1256, those assumptions are about to encounter an empire that operates by entirely different rules. An empire that has already demonstrated, from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe, that it responds to resistance not with negotiation, but with erasure. an empire that treats submission as the only acceptable outcome and annihilation as an acceptable cost of obtaining it. For decades, no king felt safe. Then a new empire rose that did not fear death. The Mongol warriors who sweep across the steppes of Central Asia in the early 13th century are not an army in the conventional sense. They are the military expression of a culture that has elevated warfare to a form of art and science combined. Every man is trained from childhood to ride, shoot, and kill with efficiency that makes professional soldiers elsewhere seem like amateurs. They can cover over 100 miles in a day, striking where they are not expected and vanishing before reinforcements arrive. They communicate across vast distances using a relay system of riders and signal fires that allows coordinated operations across hundreds of miles. They employ psychological warfare, intelligence gathering, and tactical flexibility on a scale no opponent has encountered. Genghis Khan, born Temujin, has unified the Mongol tribes through a combination of strategic brilliance, ruthless elimination of rivals, and an organizational genius that transforms disparate clans into a war machine of unprecedented efficiency. He divides his army into decimal units, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, each with clear chains of command that allow rapid communication and tactical adjustments. He promotes based on merit rather than birth, creating a meritocracy that attracts talented individuals from conquered peoples. He establishes a legal code, the Yasa, that governs military and civilian behavior with clear rules and severe penalties. He builds an empire not just through conquest, but through systems that can sustain conquest. The Mongol approach to warfare is based on a simple calculation. Resistance is expensive, both for the Mongols and their enemies. Therefore, the Mongols offer every city, every kingdom, in the same choice. Submit peacefully and retain your lives, your culture, and much of your autonomy under Mongol overlordship, or resist and face complete destruction. This is not a bluff. The Mongols demonstrate repeatedly that they mean exactly what they say. Cities that surrender are generally treated well, their population spared, their infrastructure preserved, their leaders allowed to govern under Mongol supervision. Cities that resist are annihilated with such thoroughness that their names become warnings to others. Genghis Khan dies in 1227, but the empire he built continues to expand under his successors. His sons and grandsons push into China, Russia, Eastern Europe, and the Islamic world. By the 1250s, the Mongol Empire is the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Hungary. And in 1256, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, leads a massive army westward with specific instructions. Bring the Islamic world under Mongol control, starting with the assassins and the Abbasid Caliphate. The choice of the assassins as a primary target is strategic. The Mongols have encountered them before. Assassins have killed Mongol envoys and officials. The order's reputation for successful political murder makes them a potential threat to Mongol administrators. But more importantly, the assassins represent exactly the kind of decentralized, ideologically motivated resistance that the Mongols find most threatening. You cannot negotiate with an organization that operates through independent cells and whose members consider death in service to their cause a form of victory. That you cannot intimidate people who have built their entire strategy around not being intimidated. So, the Mongols decide to eliminate them completely. Hulagu Khan's army numbers somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 warriors, supported by siege engineers from China, who understand how to break fortifications that have stood for centuries. The Mongols have learned from their campaigns in China how to take heavily fortified positions. They have giant crossbows, catapults, trebuchets, and explosive devices. They have engineers who can redirect rivers, undermine walls, and construct siege towers. They approach castle breaking with the same methodical precision they apply to every aspect of warfare. The Mongol intelligence network identifies the assassin fortresses throughout Persia. Alamut is the primary target, but dozens of smaller castles must also be taken. The Mongols begin systematically, surrounding strongholds and cutting off supply lines. They do not rush. Time is their ally. A castle cannot feed itself indefinitely. Water supplies can be poisoned or diverted. Relief forces can be intercepted and destroyed. The Mongols settle in for sieges that will last as long as necessary. the assassins face a problem they have never encountered before. Their entire strategy depends on their enemies caring about their own survival enough to be manipulated by fear. But the Mongols are not afraid of assassination. Individual Mongol commanders know that if they are killed, they will be replaced immediately, and the campaign will continue without pause. The Mongol system does not depend on irreplaceable individuals. Killing a Mongol general does not create political chaos or succession crises. It creates a vacancy that is filled according to established protocols, and then the war machine continues exactly as before. Worse, attempting to assassinate Mongol leaders carries enormous risk. The Mongols respond to attacks on their personnel with collective punishment on a scale that makes such attacks counterproductive. Kill one Mongol commander, and the Mongols will kill 1,000 people in retaliation, methodically destroying villages and towns until the lesson is learned. The assassins have built their reputation on the idea that killing one person can change political calculations. The Mongols have built their empire on the idea that political calculations are irrelevant in the face of overwhelming force applied without hesitation. The psychological mismatch is total. The assassins are experts at creating fear. The Mongols have spent decades becoming immune to it. The assassins rely on their enemies' desire for self-preservation. The Mongols have created a military culture where individual survival is secondary to collective victory. The assassins use invisibility and surprise as their primary weapons. The Mongols use visibility and inevitability. When the Mongol army appears on the horizon, there is no mystery about what will happen next. Surrender or die. The only question is which you choose. If you're gripped by this collision of strategies, subscribe now for more untold histories that reshape what you know. The leader of the assassins in 1256 is Rukin al-Din Khursha, a young man who has inherited a situation with no good options. His predecessors built the network of fortresses, assuming they would face enemies who could be deterred, negotiated with, or manipulated. They never planned for an enemy who would simply decide to spend whatever time and resources necessary to destroy every castle, kill every member of the order, and erase them from existence. Rukin al-Din can read the strategic situation clearly enough. The Mongols will not be dissuaded. They will not be frightened. They will not accept the continued existence of an independent assassin state. The siege of Alamut begins in earnest in November 1256. The fortress, built on its rocky prominence, is as defensible as any position in the medieval world. The approaches are narrow and steep. Supply lines cannot easily be cut because the castle has cisterns and storage that can sustain a garrison for months. And previous enemies have looked at Alamut and decided it was not worth the cost of taking. The Mongols look at Alamut and begin building siege works. The Mongol siege engineers construct platforms and towers that allow them to position artillery within range of the castle walls. They begin a methodical bombardment, using trebuchets to hurl stones and explosive devices against the fortifications. The bombardment is not constant but measured, designed to conserve ammunition while maintaining psychological pressure. Day after day, the stones fall. Walls that have stood for nearly 2 centuries begin to crack. The defenders repair damage during the night, but each repair weakens the overall structure. The castle is being worn down by patient, relentless application of force. Rukin al-Din understands that relief is not coming. The other assassin fortresses are also under siege or threat. No regional power is willing to challenge the Mongols on behalf of the assassins. The order that has survived through a combination of military capability and political maneuvering finds that its political options have evaporated. No one will negotiate with the Mongols on their behalf. No one will offer sanctuary. The rulers who once feared the assassins now fear the Mongols more. Inside Alamut, the debate is fierce. Some argue for resistance to the end. The fortress has never fallen. Its walls are strong. Its position is advantageous. To surrender is to abandon everything Hassan-i-Sabbah built. Others argue that prolonged resistance will only make the eventual outcome worse. And the Mongols have demonstrated repeatedly that cities which resist suffer far more than those which submit early. Perhaps negotiation is possible. Perhaps terms can be arranged that preserve some remnant of the order. Rukin al-Din chooses negotiation. In November 1256, he sends word to Hulagu Khan that he is willing to discuss surrender terms. The Mongols respond with conditions. The garrison must disarm, the fortress must be surrendered intact. Rukn al-Din must present himself to Hulagu Khan in person. There is no discussion of preserving assassin autonomy, no guarantee of safety for the order's members, no acknowledgement of their military capability. The terms are essentially unconditional surrender. Rukn al-Din accepts. He orders the garrison to lay down their weapons and opens the gates of Alamut to the Mongol forces. He travels to Hulagu Khan's camp, bringing with him the symbols of his authority and the expectation that he will be treated as a defeated ruler who has chosen the wise path of submission. The Mongols enter Alamut without resistance. Their engineers immediately begin cataloging the castle's defenses and resources. What they find in the libraries interests them briefly: texts on mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, Ismaili theology. Hulagu Khan orders some of the scientific and mathematical texts preserved and sent to the Mongol capital of Karakorum. The theological texts, the histories of the order, the documents that detail 2 centuries of assassin operations and philosophy, these are burned. The Mongols are not interested in preserving the ideological foundation of an organization they intend to eliminate. Rukn al-Din is treated with initial courtesy, but is effectively a prisoner. He is kept with Hulagu Khan's court as the Mongol army moves on to the next assassin fortress, then the next. One by one, the mountain strongholds fall. Some resist briefly and are taken by force. Others, seeing Alamut's fate, surrender when the Mongols appear. The network that took 2 centuries to build is dismantled in less than a year. The systematic nature of the destruction is remarkable. The Mongols are not content with military victory. They want to ensure that the assassins cannot reconstitute themselves. Fortresses are not just captured, but demolished. Their walls pulled down so thoroughly that rebuilding would require starting from scratch. Libraries are burned. Weapons are confiscated. The population of each fortress is dispersed, sent to different regions where they cannot easily regroup or maintain their identity as a cohesive unit. By the end of 1257, the assassin state in Persia has ceased to exist. What took Hassan-i-Sabah and his successors 167 years to build has been erased in approximately 14 months. The Mongols have demonstrated something that defeats the entire logic of asymmetric warfare. If your enemy is willing to spend unlimited resources and accept unlimited casualties to achieve total victory, there is no clever strategy that can overcome the raw mathematics of force applied without constraint. Rukn al-Din, the last lord of Alamut, travels with the Mongol court for several months. He requests permission to travel to Karakorum, the Mongol capital, to personally present his submission to Mongol Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. Hulagu Khan grants this permission. Rukn al-Din begins the journey eastward. He never arrives. According to some accounts, he is killed on the road by Mongol guards who claim he attempted to escape. According to others, he reaches Karakorum, but is refused an audience and killed on the return journey. The details vary, but the outcome is consistent. The last master of Alamut disappears, and with him, the last symbol of assassin political authority. The message is clear. The Mongols do not take chances with potential focal points of resistance. Rukn al-Din, alive, even in captivity, remains a figure around whom survivors might rally. Rukn al-Din, dead, is merely history. The destruction of the assassin state in Persia is complete by 1258, but the story does not end with Alamut's fall. The assassins maintain a significant presence in Syria, all where they control a different network of mountain fortresses and have developed complex relationships with crusader states, other Muslim powers, and local populations. The Syrian assassins have operated with some independence from the Persian branch, developing their own leadership and strategies. They watch the annihilation of their Persian counterparts with growing dread, understanding that the Mongol machine will eventually turn its attention westward. Before dealing with Syria, Hulagu Khan has other business. In 1258, his army reaches Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the city that has been the symbolic and often political center of the Islamic world for 5 centuries. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, makes a catastrophic miscalculation. He believes the Mongols can be managed diplomatically. He believes that Baghdad's religious significance will deter the Mongols from extreme measures. He believes, essentially, that the rules of traditional Islamic politics still apply. He sends inadequate forces to confront the Mongol army and attempts to negotiate from a position of weakness. The Mongols demand complete surrender. Al-Mustasim hesitates, attempting to bargain for terms that preserve some measure of Abbasid authority. The Mongols interpret this hesitation as resistance. They storm Baghdad in February 1258, and what follows is one of the most devastating massacres in medieval history. Estimates of the dead range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Libraries that contain irreplaceable manuscripts are burned. The House of Wisdom, which has been a center of learning for centuries, is destroyed. The Tigris River is said to run black with ink from the destroyed books and red with blood from the slaughtered population. Al-Mustazim himself is executed, wrapped in carpets and trampled by horses, according to one account, to avoid spilling royal blood directly. The fall of Baghdad sends shockwaves through the entire Islamic world. If the caliphate itself can be obliterated, what institution is safe? The event confirms what the destruction of the assassins has already suggested. The Mongols are not operating by the traditional rules of Islamic politics, where religious authority carries weight and symbolic positions command respect. They are operating by a different logic entirely, one where power derives solely from the ability to project overwhelming force. The Syrian assassins understand they are next. Their fortresses are formidable. Masyaf, the headquarters, is built on a similar principle to Alamut, using natural terrain to create a nearly impregnable position. But nearly impregnable means something different after Alamut. The Mongols have proven they can take any fortress given enough time and resources, and they have demonstrated no shortage of either. But Syria presents complications that Persia did not. The region is a patchwork of competing powers, Crusader states, the Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt, various local principalities, and the assassins themselves. The Mongols are deep in foreign territory, far from their supply bases, operating in terrain that does not favor the rapid cavalry maneuvers that characterize their tactics on open steppes. The logistical challenges are significant. In 1259 and 1260, the Mongol advance into Syria faces its first serious setback. Hulagu Khan withdraws a significant portion of his army to return to Mongolia following the death of Mungke Khan, needing to be present for the succession crisis that follows. The remaining Mongol forces, under the general Kitbuka, continue operations in Syria, but with reduced numbers. In September 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine, a Mamluk army from Egypt defeats the Mongol force, killing Kitbuka and halting the Mongol advance. This is the moment when Mongol expansion into the Islamic world effectively stops. The Mamluks, slave soldiers who have taken control of Egypt and developed their own military culture based on intensive training and discipline, prove to be opponents the Mongols cannot easily overwhelm. The psychological impact is enormous. The empire that seemed unstoppable has been stopped. The army that seemed invincible has been defeated. The aura of inevitability that has preceded Mongol forces across Eurasia is broken. For the Syrian assassins, this creates a complex situation. The immediate Mongol threat has receded, but the Mamluks who have defeated the Mongols are not interested in leaving an independent assassin state in the region. The Mamluk Sultan, Baybars, is a strategic thinker who understands that the assassins represent a potential threat to Mamluk authority. He also recognizes that the assassin fortresses, if left independent, could become bases for Mongol or Crusader operations in the future. Between 1260 and 1273, Baybars conducts a series of campaigns against the assassin fortresses in Syria. Unlike the Mongol approach of total annihilation, Baybars offers terms. Surrender your political independence, but retain your lives and property. Become subjects of the Mamluk Sultanate, and you will be protected. Resist, and you will be destroyed. It is, in some ways, similar to the choice the Mongols offered, but with a crucial difference. The Mamluks are fellow Muslims operating within a framework where negotiated submission is acceptable. The Syrian assassins, weakened by decades of conflict with Crusaders and other local powers, lacking support from the destroyed Persian branch, and facing an opponent who has just demonstrated the ability to defeat the Mongols, choose submission. One by one, the fortresses surrender to Mamluk authority. Unlike Alamut, they are not demolished. Unlike the Persian assassins, the Syrian communities are not dispersed and destroyed. They are absorbed into the Mamluk state, losing their political independence but maintaining their religious identity and some degree of communal organization. The assassins as an independent political and military force cease to exist. The last fortresses fall by 1273. The order that has influenced the politics of the Islamic world for nearly 2 centuries becomes a subject population, their castles garrisoned by Mamluk soldiers, their leaders accountable to Mamluk governors. The transformation is complete. The masters of fear have been mastered. But what happens to the survivors? This is where the story becomes harder to trace. The Nizari Ismaili community does not disappear. They continue to exist as a religious minority within the larger Islamic world, maintaining their theological distinctiveness while abandoning the political and military strategies that characterized the assassin period. Communities of Nizaris persist in Persia, Syria, Central Asia, and eventually India, adapting to life under various rulers who tolerate their presence as long as they do not challenge political authority. The libraries of Alamut are lost, but the oral traditions and religious knowledge survive. The Nizari Ismailis develop new forms of organization, centered around religious scholarship and community leadership rather than military capability. They become merchants, scholars, and farmers, integrated into the economic and social fabric of the regions where they live while maintaining their distinct religious identity. The Aga Khan, who in later centuries becomes the hereditary spiritual leader of the majority of Nizari Ismailis, claims descent from the Ismaili imams who preceded and survived the assassin period. The military legacy of the assassins, the Fedayeen, the culture of strategic assassination, the network of mountain fortresses, dies with the Mongol and Mamluk conquests. The religious and cultural legacy adapts and persists, transformed by the historical catastrophe into something different but continuous. This is perhaps the deeper story. Even total military defeat does not necessarily mean total erasure. The Mongols destroyed the assassin state with thoroughness that remains remarkable. They burned the libraries, demolished the fortresses, scattered the population. They did everything possible to ensure the assassins could not reconstitute themselves as a military threat. And in that specific goal, they succeeded completely. But they could not destroy the religious convictions that had motivated the assassins. They could not eliminate the communal bonds that held Nizari communities together. They could not erase the intellectual traditions that had developed over 2 centuries. These things survived in altered form, in diminished circumstances, but survived nonetheless. The order that weaponized fear was defeated by an empire that weaponized inevitability. But the people who had been assassins found ways to remain Nizari Ismailis. The historical lessons are darker and more complex than simple narratives of victory and defeat. The assassins demonstrated that asymmetric warfare, both psychological operations and strategic assassination, can be remarkably effective against certain types of opponents. For 2 centuries, they punched far above their weight, influencing events across the Islamic world, despite relatively limited military resources. Their tactics were innovative, their operational security was excellent, and their psychological understanding of how power worked allowed them to manipulate situations to their advantage. But they also demonstrated the limits of such strategies when facing an opponent who operates by fundamentally different rules. The Mongols were not vulnerable to the type of psychological warfare the assassins had perfected because the Mongol system was designed to be resilient against individual losses. You cannot frighten an organization that has built its entire culture around accepting death as a routine cost of operations. You cannot negotiate with a power that has decided your continued existence is unacceptable. You cannot use precision targeting to destabilize a hierarchy that immediately replaces casualties without political disruption. The Mongols, for their part, demonstrated what happens when overwhelming force is applied without moral constraint or political calculation. They achieved their objective, the complete elimination of the assassin threat through systematic application of military power on a scale that made resistance futile. But they also demonstrated the limits of pure force. They could destroy the assassin state, but they could not eliminate the Nizari Ismaili community. Hence, they could burn libraries and demolish fortresses, but they could not erase the ideas and beliefs those institutions represented. Even absolute military victory does not grant absolute control over the narrative or the survivors. The Mamluks demonstrated a third approach, selective incorporation. By offering terms that allowed cultural and religious survival in exchange for political submission, they achieved stability in a region where the Mongols had created only destruction. The Syrian assassins survived because they accepted subordination. This is perhaps the most disturbing lesson. In the face of overwhelming power, survival often requires the surrender of everything that made resistance meaningful in the first place. The story of the assassins and the Mongols is often told as a clash between East and West, or between Islamic and nomadic cultures, but this misses the deeper dynamic. It is a story about the nature of power itself, about how different types of power interact, about what strategies work against which opponents, and about what happens when an organization optimized for one type of conflict encounters an enemy that operates by completely different principles. The assassins built their entire strategy around the assumption that their enemies would behave rationally according to certain understood rules of political calculation. They assumed that killing the right person would create the right type of chaos. They assumed that fear of death would motivate negotiation. They assumed that their enemies would value stability enough to make concessions to an organization that could destabilize their rule through targeted killings. These assumptions were valid for nearly 200 years, against dozens of different opponents. Then they encountered an opponent for whom these assumptions were completely invalid, and the entire strategic edifice collapsed. This is the nightmare scenario for any organization that relies on asymmetric warfare, encountering an enemy who simply does not care about the asymmetries you have carefully cultivated. The assassins were experts at making themselves disproportionately dangerous relative to their size. The Mongols responded by being willing to spend disproportionate resources to eliminate the threat entirely. The assassins understood psychological warfare at a sophisticated level. The Mongols had built a culture that was psychologically immune to the specific type of warfare the assassins practiced. The matchup was not just unfavorable, it was catastrophic. And yet, elements of the assassin legacy survived and even flourished in unexpected ways. The Nizari Ismaili community exists today, numbering in the millions, spread across multiple continents, organized under the leadership of the Aga Khan. They maintain their distinct theological positions while participating fully in the modern world. The fortresses are ruins, visited by tourists and historians. The libraries are ash. The fidayeen are figures of historical and mythological interest. But the community that produced all of these things persists, transformed beyond recognition from its 13th century incarnation, but maintaining continuity with it. The legend of the assassins survived longer and spread farther than the reality ever did. Medieval Europeans, and encountering the order during the Crusades, brought back stories that grew in the telling. The Old Man of the Mountain became a figure of mystery and terror in Western literature, appearing in works by Marco Polo, medieval chroniclers, and eventually modern fiction. The word assassin itself entered multiple languages, carrying connotations far beyond its historical referent. The image of the skillful killer, motivated by ideological devotion, willing to die to complete a mission, striking from the shadows, this archetype is echoed through centuries of literature, film, and political mythology. The historical assassins would barely recognize themselves in these representations. The medieval fidayeen were not professional killers in the modern sense. They were believers engaged in what they understood as a form of religious and political resistance against powers they considered illegitimate. They were not motivated by money or personal gain, but by theological conviction and communal loyalty. Their willingness to die was not pathological, but rational within their worldview. They believed in an afterlife where their martyrdom would be rewarded, and they believed their actions served a greater good for their community and their faith. The Mongols who destroyed them were also not the simple barbarians of Western legend. They were practitioners of warfare at a level of sophistication that would not be matched until the modern era. They understood logistics, intelligence gathering, psychological operations, combined arms tactics, and strategic planning on a continental scale. They were literate, their leaders often multilingual, their administration cosmopolitan and meritocratic. They destroyed the assassins not through mindless violence, but through carefully planned military operations, executed with professional competence. The collision between these two sophisticated organizations, each representing different aspects of medieval military and political innovation, resulted in one of the most complete and rapid military defeats in history. The speed of the assassin collapse is striking. In 1255, they controlled dozens of fortresses across Persia and Syria, maintained a feared military reputation, and operated as an independent political entity that had to be considered in any regional calculation. By 1258, their Persian branch had been completely destroyed, and by 1273, their Syrian branch had been forcibly incorporated into the Mamluk state, 20 years from independence to extinction as a political force. This rapidity suggests vulnerability that was not apparent before the Mongol campaign. The assassins had survived for 2 centuries, but they had survived in a specific strategic environment, a fragmented Islamic world where no single power could afford to dedicate the resources necessary to eliminate them completely, and where the cost of leaving them alone was lower than the cost of destroying them. The Mongols changed the calculation. They had the resources, they had the will, and they did not accept the continued existence of an independent assassin state as a tolerable outcome. Once that decision was made, the assassins had no effective counter-strategy. Could they have fought differently? The question is debated by historians. Some argue that if the assassins had mounted a more aggressive guerrilla campaign against the Mongols, using their skills in infiltration and assassination to target Mongol supply lines and command structure, they might have made the conquest costly enough to deter it. Others point out that such tactics would only have intensified Mongol determination to eliminate the threat, and the assassins lacked the population base and resources to sustain a prolonged guerrilla war against an enemy as systematic as the Mongols. The truth is probably that once the Mongols decided to destroy the assassins, no strategy available to the order could have prevented it. The resource disparity was too great, the Mongol advantages in siege warfare too pronounced, the isolation of the assassin fortresses too complete. The assassins had built their defenses to withstand medieval Islamic armies. They found themselves facing siege engineering techniques developed in China, applied by an army that could draw on resources from across the largest empire in human history. The strategic context had changed in ways that made their previous advantages irrelevant. What remains most disturbing about the story is how completely the institutional memory was destroyed. The libraries of Alamut contain not just religious texts, but scientific, mathematical, and philosophical works. They contain the organizational records of the order, how they recruited, how they trained, what their internal debates were, how they made strategic decisions. All of this was burned. The Mongols preserved some scientific texts that they considered useful. Yeah, but the bulk of the assassin-written tradition was deliberately destroyed. This was not collateral damage, but policy. The Mongols understood that organizations can reconstitute themselves if their knowledge base survives. By burning the libraries, they ensured that even if individual assassins survived, they could not easily rebuild the institutional knowledge that had made the order effective. The Fedayeen training methods, the infiltration techniques, the organizational structures, these things existed in written form in Alamut's libraries, and those writings were turned to ash. What we know about the assassins comes largely from their enemies and from later accounts that may blend fact with legend. The assassins themselves left few records that survived the Mongol conquest. This means our understanding of them is filtered through hostile sources: Sunni chroniclers who considered them heretics, Crusader observers who saw them through the lens of their own cultural assumptions, and later mythologizers who were more interested in dramatic stories than historical accuracy. The assassins cannot speak for themselves. Their voice was silenced when Alamut burned. This erasure is its own form of historical violence. It means we can never fully understand what the assassins thought they were doing, how they justified their actions to themselves, what internal debates they had, what their culture was like beyond the military operations that drew historical attention. We know them almost entirely through their impacts on others, rather than through their own self-understanding. They become, in some sense, exactly what they sought to avoid: shadows without substance, known only by the fear they created rather than by the community and culture they built. The legend survived longer than the power because legends require only the repetition of stories, while power requires the continuous application of force, the maintenance of institutions, the reproduction of capabilities across generations. Once the fortresses fell and the organizational structure was destroyed, the power evaporated almost immediately. But the stories of the Fedayeen who died without hesitation, of Hassan-i Saba's strategic genius, of the old man of the mountain who commanded absolute loyalty, of the blade that could appear anywhere. These stories could be retold without castles or armies. They could be embellished, transformed, adapted to new contexts. The historical assassins disappeared, but the mythological assassins became immortal. And in that immortality lies perhaps the darkest implication of all. The Mongols could destroy the reality, but not the memory. And the memory they could not destroy has become something more dangerous than the reality ever was. The historical assassins killed dozens of people over 2 centuries. The mythological assassins have inspired countless acts of political violence by people who see in the legend a justification for their own actions. The word assassin has become synonymous with political murder, carrying connotations that the original Fedayeen would barely recognize but that nevertheless trace back to them. The Mongols achieved total military victory. They destroyed every fortress, killed or scattered every soldier, burned every library, but he eliminated the assassin state so completely that it could never reconstitute itself. And yet, 8 centuries later, the assassins are remembered, and the Mongol conquest of them is a footnote. The paradox of historical memory is that what survives is not always what was strongest, but what was most memorable. Power fades, stories persist. The assassins built their strategy on creating powerful stories, stories of fear, of capability, of mysterious reach. Those stories outlasted everything else they built. What does it mean that the organization destroyed most completely is the one we remember most vividly? What does it say about the nature of historical memory that the assassins are far more famous than most of the kingdoms that outlasted them? The Seljuk Empire, which the assassins targeted so effectively, now is known primarily to specialists. The assassins are known to anyone with a passing interest in medieval history. The very completeness of their destruction seems to have amplified, rather than diminished, their legend. This suggests something uncomfortable about human memory and meaning-making. We are drawn to dramatic failures more than successful adaptations, to spectacular collapses more than gradual transformations, to extinction more than survival. The Nizari Ismaili community survived the Mongol conquest and exists to this day, but their survival is less dramatically compelling than the fall of Alamut. The story we remember is the story of destruction, not the story of endurance. The Mongols understood something about power that the assassins either did not understand or chose to reject, that sometimes the most effective strategy is the most straightforward one. The assassins built elaborate systems of infiltration, careful targeting, psychological manipulation. The Mongols responded with overwhelming force applied without hesitation, complexity lost to simplicity, subtlety lost to directness, precision lost to magnitude. The lesson is brutal but historically validated. If your enemy is willing to spend enough and endure enough, no amount of cleverness can substitute for raw capability. But the Mongols also demonstrated the limits of pure force. They could conquer but not convert. They could destroy institutions but not ideas. They could kill the assassins but could not kill what the assassins represented. The idea that small groups, properly organized and motivated, can challenge much larger powers. That idea survived Alamut's fall and has resurfaced repeatedly in different forms across subsequent centuries. Every revolutionary movement, every insurgency, every asymmetric conflict contains echoes of the assassin model. Be small, be dedicated, strike precisely, leverage psychological impact, and hope your enemies value stability more than they value your elimination. Sometimes it works. The assassins made it work for 2 centuries. And sometimes you encounter an enemy who does not value stability more than your elimination, who is willing to pay any cost to ensure you cease to exist, who meets your psychological warfare with a psychology that is immune to fear. Then all the cleverness in the world cannot save you. The assassins discovered this truth in the most final way possible. Their story is a warning about the limits of asymmetric warfare, a demonstration of what happens when your strategic assumptions encounter reality that does not conform to them, and a reminder that power, real, sustainable power, requires more than reputation. Reputation can amplify limited power, but it cannot substitute for power entirely. When the Mongols came, the assassins discovered that 2 centuries of fearsome reputation meant nothing against an enemy that simply did not care. The ruins of Alamut still stand in the mountains of Persia, visited occasionally by historians and the curious. The stones remember nothing. The libraries are silent. The Fedayeen sleep in unmarked graves. Yet the Nizari Ismaili community continues, transformed beyond recognition. The Mongol Empire fragmented and disappeared. The Mamluk Sultanate fell to the Ottomans. The Crusader states were reconquered and dissolved. Everything that seemed permanent in the 13th century has changed or vanished. Except the stories. The stories remain, growing stranger with each retelling, the historical assassins becoming increasingly mythological, the mythological assassins becoming increasingly historical. Somewhere in the confusion of memory and legend, the truth of what happened in those mountains 8 centuries ago becomes harder to grasp. But perhaps that is fitting. An organization that built its power on the manipulation of perception and the creation of mythology has become itself a myth. All-powerful not for what it was, but for what people believe it was. And in the darkness of that belief, new assassins are always being born, not in mountain fortresses or under the guidance of the old man of the mountain, but in the imaginations of those who see in the legend a model for their own actions. The Mongols destroyed the organization, but not the idea. The idea persists, mutating, adapting, finding new hosts. The Fedayeen are gone, but the dream of the perfect political murder, the blade that changes history, the devoted few who can reshape the world through precisely applied violence, that dream survives in countless forms. This is perhaps the most disturbing legacy. The assassins succeeded in creating something that outlasted their destruction, but what survived was not their community or their faith, but their methodology. It's stripped of its context and theological justification, reduced to pure technique. The word assassin no longer refers to Nizari Ismailis engaged in resistance against powers they considered illegitimate. It refers to anyone who kills for political purposes, regardless of ideology or justification. The assassins became the name for what they did, rather than who they were. In the end, the Mongols won the war, but lost the battle for meaning. They eliminated the threat, destroyed the organization, scattered the population. But they could not control what the story became, and the story became something larger and darker than the reality ever was. A myth of invincibility broken, of mountain fortresses that could not be held, of psychological warfare defeated by an enemy that felt no fear, of reputation meeting reality and shattering against it. The empire that feared nothing destroyed the masters of fear. But fear, it turns out, is harder to kill than people. It survives in different forms, wearing different faces, speaking different languages. The specific fear the assassins created, the fear of the blade appearing from nowhere, wielded by someone you trusted. That fear died with Alamut. But the general fear they represented, the fear of small groups with total commitment who refuse to accept the world as it is and are willing to die to change it, that fear persists. Every generation discovers it anew, gives it a new name, fights a new war against it. The Mongols are gone, the assassins are gone, the fear remains. And in that fear, the story finds new life, again and again, in an endless cycle of threat and response, and reputation and reality, legend and truth. The ruins in the mountains remember nothing, but we remember, and in remembering, we give the dead a power they could never have claimed in life. The power to shape how we understand violence, politics, devotion, and the terrible things humans do in service of ideas they consider more important than their own lives. This is what survives 8 centuries. Not the truth, but the meaning we assign to it. Not what happened, but what we believe happened. Not the assassins, but the idea of them. And ideas, unlike fortresses, cannot be besieged and taken. They can only be confronted again and again in every generation that must decide what it believes about power, fear, faith, and the price of resistance. The Mongols taught the assassins that reputation without power is nothing. The assassins taught history that power without meaning is forgotten. Both lessons remain, waiting in the ruins of Alamut, for anyone willing to climb the mountain and read what the stones no longer say. What do you think? Could any strategy have saved the assassins from Mongol determination? Or was their doom sealed the moment an empire that did not negotiate appeared on the horizon? Share your thoughts below.